So the second part of a duplex presentation. So we're again Azure Active Directory Connect. But while in the first one we were mostly talking, the second one is full of demos. And we're actually going down into the nitty-gritty. How does it work? What kind of rules are there? And how does it work in multi-forest scenarios and things like that. So for the ones that weren't in session number 1, my name is Roelf Zomerman, originally from the Netherlands, hence the Dutch connection with Sander, the co-host. I currently live in Dubai. I've never ever been a Microsoft MVP, because everybody who's presenting is like I'm a 20-year, 19-year, or 7-year MVP. I never had one. But it could be because I work for Microsoft now. I'm a cloud solution architect in the Gulf. I don't normally do anything with identities, because I'm focused on Azure itself. But I kind of like Azure Active Directory, and I blog a lot on this about this topic on my blog, blog.azureinfra.com, or formerly known as studiographic.nl. And that's it. Co-host, Sander.
Yes, I'm joining Roelf today. I'm also from the Netherlands, but still there. I didn't flee the country. I can handle the cold, unlike the Zomerman.
Yeah.
Yep. And I've been a directory MVP for the last 9 years. They call it Enterprise MVP now. Enterprise Mobility MVP.
Told you, right? Told you.
Yeah.
Yeah.
What?
No, nothing.
Oh.
And
okay.
he blogs actually at thedeerteam.com. So he's part of the. Sorry.
Thank you.
Awesome site, by the way.
Yeah. So that one's maintained by I think like 80% of all the speakers here.
No, actually no.
No.
But
okay.
go ahead.
Anyway. So the agenda for today is, so we're going to dive into the synchronization engine itself. So I'm not going to talk about any of the other add-ons that Azure AD Connect itself has, like the password authentication agent or the health agents or whatever. We're going to pure look at synchronization itself. For the password authentication agent as well as seamless sign-on, I actually have a session at 4 o'clock about that one. We're going to take a look at what are immutable IDs and what kind of anchors do we have and why do they matter, and the impact of those into Active Directory migrations. So if you're looking at acquisitions and mergers, in order to connect those two accounts, or when you do a migration itself and making sure that people can still access their Office 365 mailbox, that's what we'll be looking at today.
Executions and murders. Yep.
And then, of course, how to handle conflict resolution. So there's a difference in the old version and the new version. But if you're looking at multiple forests or multiple sources, you can have conflicts. And how do you make sure that you find those conflicts and then iron them out really easy and really quickly? And that's all for the big topic, which is actually really small. Breaking the rules. So by default, a rule set is being implemented in Azure Active Directory Connect. What makes up those rules, how can we change them, and are we allowed to change them in order to make Azure Active Directory work for your particular scenario?
Yep. And in contrast to the first session that we did this morning, this is going to be a demo-filled one. So we don't have the same amount of slides. We have very little slides. Roelf is going to mainly demo the stuff.
If it all works.
Here we go.
Yeah.
If it all works. So you get a good feeling on how it feels as an admin to do stuff like that.
Yeah. So a small note, I actually have a little bit of a cough, and he apparently picked it up from me. So if I turn away and then cough into my scarf, then don't be alarmed. You're not going to die. I'm not going to die, but it's more annoying for me than for you, or maybe for you, for me. I don't know. So in order for synchronization, because it's actually synchronization, right? We're not copying users over. We're not moving users over. We're synchronizing objects from one directory to another directory. And within Azure Active Directory and your on-premises Active Directory, you actually have 3 Active Directories, or you could have more. But, so you have your on-premises Active Directory. That one has your domain admin or your enterprise admin. It can have one or multiple domains in a single forest. It can actually have multiple forests as well. You have then Azure Active Directory, and in Azure Active Directory you have your global administrator or your limited administrator. They could be the same person, the domain administrator and the global administrator, but they don't necessarily have to be. Object-wise, they are not the same, right? And if you spin it up, if you spin up Azure Active Directory Domain Services, then the Active Directory Domain Services actually has another administrative group, the AADC administrators. And again, it can be the same single person that's assigned multiple roles over all 3 of them, but it can be individual roles as well, right? But they are completely separate. If you're running a federated scenario or a pass-through authentication scenario, make sure that you have an administrator that's able to log into the second one and the third one without being dependent on your on-premises Active Directory. Because if for whatever reason your on-premises Active Directory will fail, and you only have one administrator that's also federated, you can't log into Azure Active Directory, you can't log into your Azure Active Directory domain services, right? So for today, we're just going to focus on Azure Active Directory and Active Directory, and we're going to leave domain services out of it, but I just wanted to let you know. So in my on-premises Active Directory, I actually have a user object, and in my Azure Active Directory, I'm going to refer to a cloud user. It's still a user object, but in order to make the distinction between the two, that they're not the same object. So what we need to do is make sure that we tie those identities together, because ultimately, while they're 2 separate objects, we want to make sure that a single person can actually log into both of them at the same time, right? So in the back end, we have Azure AD Connect that's synchronizing the 2. And between Azure Active Directory and Azure Active Directory domain services, there's an automated sync in the back end. We can't do much about it. So forget about it. So how does MIAS work under the hood? So on the left side, you have Active Directory, you have a user account, and ultimately we want to send that user account over to Azure Active Directory, right? We want to synchronize it. So Azure AD Connect, basically what it does is it imports that user account or all those users' account and is going to copy it into what they call connector space. So there's an agent, a management agent connecting to your Active Directory. That agent has a connector space and it reads all your users and it's going to store them. So it's still a user object, and of course, the wrong button. You have a UPN, you have an email, you have an object GUID, like all kinds of different attributes are stored in that as well. The connector space is a one-to-one copy of your on-premises Active Directory. And then we're going to do a synchronization into what we call a metaverse. It's the main database that we push all those objects into. So while each Active Directory or each source, an LDAP, for example, has their own management agent or connector space, the metaverse is just one database, right? So we move the object from the connector space into the metaverse, and then it's going to be transported to a person. Because a person can have multiple identities on multiple systems, right? So we need to join multiple connectors, and then we can add it into this. I'll do this in a demo, and then it will become all clear. So while an object is moving from the connector space into the metaverse during the synchronization, that's when rules apply, right? So if a display name on Active Directory is John, in the connector space, the display name is going to be John. But then when I move it into the metaverse, through a rule, I can say, this is John Smith, because I'm going to add the last name into it as well. So we do another synchronization from the metaverse to the Azure AD connector space, the other management agent, and that one actually does the export into Azure Active Directory. Right? So from Azure Active Directory, we can also do an import, apply additional rules, and add additional information into the metaverse. Right. So let's see this. Well,
One small addition. So you said user on the left, but it's also iNetwork person.
Yeah, so it's user, iNetwork person, or group.
Yep.
Can be.
And you can also sync contacts and groups
Yep.
and devices.
Yep. So for the FIM and MIM people, this is probably pretty familiar. It's the Miis client. It's installed with Azure AD Connect by default. It's C program files, Azure AD Connect UI shell, and then miisclient.exe. And you see here on the name, you already see forest-root.onmicrosoft.com, which is my Azure Active Directory connector, and my forest-root.local, which is my domain service connector.
Can you zoom in a bit? I can't see it. Control 1.
I think I need to like open Zoom or something, because it's not zooming.
No, it's not zooming?
Maybe just change your resolution.
Should do control. Yeah, there you go.
There we go.
Right, so you got force_root.local, which is my local domain service, and the force_root.onmicrosoft.com domain service. Now, when I said that that connector space, so let's take the force_root.local connector. That connector space is a one-to-one copy of whatever I have in my domain. But what if I don't want that to be, right? I just want to have a selective number of OUs, or just a different, if I have multiple forests, just a single domain. So what I can do is I can actually go to the properties of this connector, go to the partitions, and then here I can select containers. It's going to ask me for a username and password, just to read the containers. Oh. Administrator. Oh, sorry. There we go. And then here you basically get an overview of all the OUs, and you can select which OU you want to synchronize. So as you can see, in my scenario, I just said I just want the forest root OU to be synchronized and nothing else. And this is how you can connect multiple Active Directories to a single Azure AD tenant without getting conflict. If you have, for example, an OU with students and you have another forest with teachers, those you can basically say for one synchronization engine, I want all the students, the other synchronization engine, just take the students, so that administrators or guest account or any other account, service support accounts, are not synchronized and cannot cause any corruption or duplication. So this was one of the questions from the previous slides. So as said, let's create a new user. I made a small PowerShell that basically creates a user in my Active Directory, and then we're going to say run. So the running itself, so you have basically a few profiles. So you have full import, which basically says scan the entire Active Directory, or in this case the entire OU, for changes. You can also do a delta import as well, and that's basically give me all the changes since the last synchronization. So the agent itself keeps a track of the changes that happen in Active Directory and the change number that applies for that. So in this case, I only added one user. I'll just do a full import. It's going to not take very long. So it's going to read it, and then ultimately it's going to see that we have a new user. If all is fine. Yep, there you go. We'll do control 1. Right, so here you see that there's 6 unchanged objects. There's one add. And I can actually click that single add as well. So this is where the troubleshooting starts. So if by default everything works, then it's fine. But if something doesn't work, you can basically go manually, just import it, see if you can find the user. So if I click the user, sorry. So here you see that we read, and I'll do the zoom thingy again. Here you see what kind of objects attributes we're already adding, right? So we're adding the common name, which in my case is forest user 5, country code, display name, given name, mail, etc., etc. So as many of you might recall in the previous session, Sander said that in a default AD Connect installation, there's 151 different attributes that are synchronized.
Unique attributes.
Unique attributes that are synchronized. This is nearly not 151. And that's because if an attribute is empty, we're not importing it. Right? So by default, there are a lot of attributes, extension attribute 1 till 15 or 60, whatever it is. For my account, those are empty. That's why they're not important, and that's why you don't see them in this list as well. So this object is now in my connector space itself. But we also want to do the synchronization, right? Within MIAS, you can basically say, I want to do a full synchronization, but you can also do what's called a projection or a preview. What will happen to this object? What kind of rules will apply to this object if I were to do a synchronization? So that one's really handy. So you can actually go into the connector space, search for a particular user, or just add it as I just did now. Click Properties, and then this window will show up. And you already see that you can either choose a full synchronization or a delta synchronization, and then a generate preview. So if I do the generate preview, nothing changed, nothing is embedded into my metaverse yet. it's just a preview that I can see what will happen if I were to execute this, which is pretty convenient. So I see the source object details, same as what we saw earlier. And then we have the attribute flow itself. So I'll zoom in again. Because the attribute flow is important, because in the attribute flow, that's basically which kind of attributes will go into which attributes. I just need to go a little bit more to the right. And which rules apply to this. So it's shortened here, but it's in from AD, and that's a particular rule that we'll look at later. And then it says the object SID is a direct connect from the object SID source object. But the CN is also direct. Let's see, take one. This one, for example, the source anchor apparently has a very complex rule applied to it. Right? So that's where you can find out if you're synchronizing your users from on-premises to Azure Active Directory and you're thinking, where does this particular attribute come from? It comes from this.
As an addition, during the first session I told you that you could have a pilot setting, that you can only synchronize a couple of users that are part of a specific group. If you have your first synchronizations done, like Roelf is now showing you, you can actually see what stuff is going to Azure AD for your users, what objects, what attributes, that kind of stuff. And you can actually, I think if we can show you, you can show your managers, right? And if we can explain it, even if we can explain it to you, then you will surely be able to explain it to your managers as well, that there's nothing really to worry about. And if there is something to worry about, that you could actually change it, and you know what rule to change if you want to.
Yep. And it's also to show you that there's no secrets under the box. Everything is clear in plain sight. So the other thing in the projection is that if we were to put this object into the metaverse, and as I said, and then it converts into a person, because it connects to, or can connect to multiple connectors. So this is where you see those connectors. So if this person was to be in the metaverse itself, this is the first connector, which is the forest-root.local, and this is the Azure Active Directory connector. Now, because it's Azure Active Directory, we don't know if a particular object is going to be unique. So that's why we create a random GUID for the object that we put in Azure Active Directory. So that's why it has like a very weird name. I'll zoom in. That's why it has a very weird name, like column 337, blah, 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 instead of just forest user number 5. You can also see what the properties of each connector are. So we already saw this one. And this one is the attribute export flow that we're going to push into Azure Active Directory if we were to execute the synchronization and then the export itself. You can already see that we have a lot more attributes here that are automatically filled because of the synchronization rules that we have. It's still not the 150, but there are a lot more in here. So let's execute this one. So if we go back to start preview, I can actually do a commit, continue, and that's it. That's the synchronization on a single object, right? So now it's synchronized, which means we should be able to find it in the metaverse. And we actually have a metaverse search in here as well. So I did a search earlier today. So it says, I'll go a little bit down. Forest user 1, 3, and 4. And apparently we just imported number 5. So if I would do a refresh on the search, there you go, object number 5. And you would basically see the same attributes. And if you go to connectors, you would see the same information on the connectors. So if we now want to export this, and remember by default, if you run the Azure AD Connect, this happens in the background, right? It's scheduled task where it does import, synchronization, export, and then import again from Azure AD, and then et cetera, et cetera. But for now, we'll do an export. Oh, before I do the export, I can search for the connector space. So we saw that we put the object into connector space of the forest root. We pushed it into the metaverse. We did a synchronization to get it into the metaverse, which means it's pending for export to go to Azure Active Directory. So if we want to know what is exactly going to be pushed out into Azure Active Directory, I can search the connector space for Azure Active Directory, see what's pending as export, and we'll see that it's number 3. So you can here say select pending export, add, modify, and deletes, search. And there you go. So we found that there's something ready to be exported. If we double click it, it's our forced user number 5. Right? So it's not there yet. We just need to run the export itself. So if I were to run the export now, export, it's running, and then in the statistics, it's going to show you that it synchronized a few users out. Hopefully. Anyway.
Question?
Yeah.
Is there a way to export one user? Or do you have to export the entire connector space?
You have to export the entire connector space. Yeah.
You can export one user, but it's going to be random. It won't be
Yeah,
like-
so, yeah.
No, I mean, I want to pick the one I want to do, yeah.
Yeah. So you can say there's you can say I only want 20 objects to be exported, but you don't get to decide which objects those are. It's a bit annoying.
All these stuff that you just clicked, and you said, run a full synchronization, stuff like that. You can run the profiles using PowerShell. It's really handy for these kinds of scenarios. I know of a lot of people, and I'm not gonna ask you to show your hands because that's foolish, but there's a lot of organizations that don't use the built-in scheduler for Azure AD Connect, but have their own schedule with scheduled tasks that kick off the PowerShell scripts. That's all fun and games, but the release notes for version 1.1.6 for 7.0, that was 3 weeks ago, specifically warn you about not doing that because your functionality will break after June 30th of next year. So please be advised to use the built-in scheduler.
All right.
That was the official tone, right?
All right.
Okay.
So the demo that I just did is like, this is how it works in the back end if you have any synchronization, right? Of course, it's not I didn't change any rules. I just showed you how it works. So if you have a default installation, just an Express installation, you don't have to do all of this. It's when you need to change the rules when this becomes really important.
So how does update and delete work? And what mechanism that it will detect this is an update? In the case of a delete, the object will go into a deleting container. So what does it need to do?
So the first question is like the update. So what it does is it keeps track of the Active Directory changes that happen, and there's a unique number, a USN number, that happens on every domain controller, and it basically follows that particular number. So if someone changes his phone number, the USN goes up because there's a single change on an attribute. It picks it up, it says this is the attribute that changed, it will import that particular change of the attribute, run it through the synchronization rules, and add it into that person object.
So it
Right.
looks at the complete forest, or it just look at one particular domain controller?
It looks at a single domain, and by default it chooses a random domain controller that is closest to him. But if you want, you can actually specify I want it to point to a single domain controller.
Let me make that really clear. Global catalog.
Global catalog. No.
Global catalog does not have all the attributes.
Yes. Global catalog doesn't have all the attributes.
No, but by default it looks at the catalog.
All right. And then on the deletes, so when a delete happens, it basically means that the USN is there that something was missing. The agent that actually reads it finds out that the object was no longer there, and then marks it as a deletion inside the metaverse itself for that specific connector.
So it does not go after the deleting container.
No. So I pointed it to like a single OU. So if I now take that object and move it to a different OU, it would fall out of scope, and therefore it would be removed from this particular connector, right? So the important thing is that, and we'll show you that later, by the way, when we do the AD migration. Okay.
So sorry, is it USN or Facebook that synchronizing? Because if it's random, the desync is USN.
Yeah, no, it's not the USN. It's the other one. It's the vector thingy. There's a USN for each domain controller, and then there's oh damn it, this is long ago. See, I told you we need to do a presentation on
Update
that.
vector?
Yeah.
Okay.
That one. So the changes of all the, it's not a changes on the single domain controllers, it's changes within an entire domain. Yeah.
But it's funny because we just mentioned the scenario where you have a limited scope in Active Directory, and you have a user that falls out of scope. That's exactly one of these scenarios that we're going to face the problems with in the demo.
Yep.
Yep.
So, go back to the slides while I was actually logging in. So when you install in a custom installation, you will see this particular screen, and it says uniquely identifying your users. Now, as you saw earlier, is that you have an on-premises Active Directory and your Azure Active Directory, and we need to make a link between the users between them, right? So I can say I can put that link via UPN or email address, but users' email addresses and the UPNs can change. So that's why we need to have an anchor between the two, and that anchor is an attribute that doesn't change or should not change. And that's what we call the ImmutableID. Or we used to call it the ImmutableID, and now we call it a source cloud anchor. So in the earlier versions of Azure AD Connect and DeerSync and Azure AD Sync, that cloud anchor was based on the object GUID of a user or an object. And then people started migrating directory from one directory to another domain, and they found out that the object GUID is specific to a domain, and you cannot move it into another domain.
Or they were reanimating objects, resulting in the same situation.
Resulting in the same situation where basically I could log in and see the guy who was fired yesterday, and I replaced him, and I can see his mailbox.
Yeah, so that's
Right.
why since the 1.500 branch, the Azure AD Connect installer or the configuration wizard now warns you if you don't have the Active Directory recycle bin enabled.
Yep.
Because that is one of the methods that allows you to actually not reanimate, but delete an object with the same object GUID.
Yep. So in the later versions, we thought object GUID is just silly, let's do something else. And apparently there's something called an MSDS consistency GUID. You can still put a GUID in there, and it can be the object GUID. You can manually copy it over. But it's basically a field that's not being used anywhere, and you can use it as the anchor, right? Because you have influence over it. So that's why in the later versions, if you don't change anything, the object GUID of an object is being copied into the MSDS consistency GUID, and the MSDS consistency GUID is being used as the ImmutableID, as the anchor between your on-premises and your cloud user.
They're doing that automatically now?
Yes.
Yep.
That's why if you have your federation services,
At first sync.
yeah,
At first sync, and then after that, you have to manage it.
No. Because you don't want to.
you don't change it afterwards anymore. Right?
We'll show
It's-
you in the demo.
We do?
Why? Yeah,
Oh.
let's say if I take it.
He's gonna demo
Oh, no,
it.
you're demo.
I have a question on that.
Yeah.
So let's say I have multiple Active Directory independent of each other, and I have the identity in there. Everywhere.
Got you. Don't worry.
You have all those people just.
I know. So
Getting
the
ahead of
question that
us.
he's asking is, what if I have multiple Active Directories and I don't have that, I already have like consistency GUID or MSDS consistency GUID spread all over the place, and they're all different, but the user still needs to be uniquely identified between two different forests. That's why they changed, that's why the first option is here, is like uniquely identifying your users over the different forests. So they don't have a particular name for it, so I called it the forest anchor in my blog, and I'm hoping that they will adopt it. So the forest anchor basically allows you to say this user in directory A is exactly the same as this user in directory B, because this particular attribute matches. And then you can still use the MSDS consistency GUID or any other attribute to say this is the cloud source anchor that matches this object of those two Active Directories as a single user in Azure Active Directory, right? So you have the forest anchor and you have the cloud source anchor. So this is what I was trying to explain. So in an ideal scenario, if you have 3 Active Directories and you have a single Azure AD Connect, you basically want each user to be uniquely identified in each Active Directory and then synchronized as a single user into Azure Active Directory. This is the ideal world. That usually doesn't happen. It usually looks more like this. A single user has an account in both Active Directories, meaning it's a single person, meaning he gets a single account on Azure Active Directory.
So what if you run an Exchange resource forest, for instance, this is what you'll see. You'll have a mailbox on a user object in forest A, and you have the actual user object that is used by the user in another forest.
Yep. So the wizard itself allows you to say, I have 3 predefined anchors that I can use for it, which is mail nickname, which is a very easy one because everybody knows where to find it. It's just mail. If you have an Exchange resource forest, it's the combination of the object SID, the MS Exchange master account SID, and mail and some other fields. You can say the SAM account name and the mail nickname, or you can say other, and that's where you basically decide this is my attribute.
I want to ask a more complicated question, but first I want to ask, are you going to later in this session go into issues with upgrading from older versions of AD Sync to newer ones to cover the MSDS consistency GUID?
So if you upgrade today and if you're using the object GUID because you are at an older version, it's not going to change anything.
I wrote a rule to use MS consistency GUID because they didn't have it back when we
Yeah, so I had exactly the same. And if you try to run the upgrade's going to fail. Because it's going to try to inject another rule that's basically doing the same thing.
So should I say my question until after you guys are all done?
You can.
I think
But it's
we'll
very-
give you
it's-
some
it's-
lifecycle management pointers based on stage mode, how you can handle that.
Yeah. So what I did in my tenant is I actually spun up a new server, installed the latest version of AD Connect, changed the rules as I wanted them, did the preview that I just showed you to see if everything matched up, and as soon as everything matched up, discarded the old one, enabled the new one.
And there's a tool for that even, it's CS Analyzer that you can
And
use.
since
Yeah.
MS consistency GUID already has a value, it won't do that first run because the
Correct.
new users are going to get that copy automatically.
Correct. So when you configure this forest anchor, it's going to configure a join rule. And the join rule is basically, I have 2 different or multiple connectors. Where should I join them based on which attribute? Right? We'll go to that into the demo itself. If you don't know what your forest anchor is today, you can actually open up the Azure AD Connect icon that you have on your desktop and say view the current configuration. If you view the current configuration, this is your source anchor, MSDS consistency GUID, and this is your custom attribute or your forest anchor. Right? And then it shows you all the other stuff as well that you have. Demo. So a little bit about the demo environment itself, because I usually get puzzled when people do demos and I don't know how it works. So I have a single Azure Active Directory tenant. It has 3 domains in there, or 3 UPNs. I have 2 Active Directory domains. You already saw this one, the forest root, replicating the forest root OU. But I actually have a second domain controller on the Azure Infra, and it actually looks at both forests in the Azure Infra OUs, and then synchronizes those users up to the same Azure Active Directory tenant.
Does anyone have any questions about this environment? Does it look familiar to any situation that you would actually encounter in the field? It does, right? Perfect.
So no one has
Let's
it?
mess it up.
Yeah.
That's demo mission.
Yeah.
Begin.
So I'm going to the Azure Infra Active Directory domain controller. And I basically have the same script. So I'm going to create a new user. It's going to create user number 7. And if all is well, if I open up AD using computers, we'll do this one. If I open up AD using computers, refresh, infra user number 7. So the thing with infra user number 7 is, and that's why I created by script, this infra user number 7 actually has an extension attribute number 1 specified. Because remember, that is my my forest anchor. If this user wouldn't have this particular anchor, so as soon as you specify a custom anchor, if the attribute is blank, the user will be imported into the connector space, but it won't flow into the metaverse, right? Because there's no unique attribute that it can connect to. So if I go to my Azure Active Directory connection, go to the connect, and this one is really, really small, and I don't know why. Right, so this one is connected to the two domains, Azure Infra Forest Root, and then the Azure Active Direct Connect, which is the top one. This is, by the way, zoomed in, so can you imagine how small it is for me? So we do run, just do a full import. It's only like 5-10 users. It's running at the moment. Dum 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 dum. There we go. And it found 0 ads. Oh, that's awesome. I did create it, right? I'll create another one. I don't know why. Demo.
So you just demoed that you're able to run a PowerShell script, right?
Yeah,
Okay. Just to make sure.
it's probably synchronization. It's probably looking at the wrong domain controller. There we go, we have an ad. Right, so the user was found, there's another ad. I'm just gonna run the synchronization now directly. Run a full synchronization, and that adds the user into the metaverse. But the idea now is that, so the user will automatically be added into Office 365 and he gets an account as well, so I can run this export. But ultimately what we want to do is we want to get to the situation where we say, the user is not part of Azure Infra, but I want to migrate him to Forest Root. Right? I'm going to do an Active Directory, an ADMT migration. So for that, I have installed Azure Active Directory migration tool, and I can do the wizard. Goes from Azure Infra to Forest Root. It's going to find the domain controller. Here you go. Infra user number 7 or number 8, whichever we want. We'll just do them both. Blah, 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 blah. Obviously, if on a real migration, you would have a password export server and all that kinds of stuff. I don't have that, because I just want to do a dirty migration. Now, the thing to note when you're doing ADMT, and this is one of the catches that got me as well, ADMT doesn't by default migrate all your attributes, right? Only a selection of attributes. So if I go to the Forest Root, because I just moved the users in there into the Azure Infra OU. Refresh. There you go, user number 8. And if I were to look at the same attribute editor to the extension attribute, you will see that it's actually empty. If that happens, again, Azure Active Directory Connect will read the object into the connector space. It won't do the synchronization into the metaverse, because there's no join rule that it can apply. Right? So that's where, again, the MIS console and going in step by step helps. So in this case, what I'll do is just need to copy the extension attribute. Refresh. Just to make sure that it's actually the same. Dum 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 dum. Forest Anchor 8. Obviously, if you are running a scripted version of ADMT, there's a particular script that you can run, or a particular command you can run, that basically says import all the attributes except for the fixed ones, like object GUID, and then it will migrate everything over. So now on my Azure AD Connect, I will run the import from the Forest Root. And if all is well, it should see 2 ads, where one is the Forest Root 7 and one is the Forest Root 8. Infra 7 and Infra 8. There you go. There they are. And remember that only on the user 8, I added the extension attribute. Right? So if I were now to go and say I want to run the synchronization, it's going to link these users, or actually it's going to link only number 8 to the existing user that was already in there, in the metaverse itself. So if I go to the metaverse search, I'll do search and I'll zoom in. There you go, you have infra user 7 and infra user 8. Now remember that on infra user 7 we didn't put the anchor. So if I go to connectors, it will show you that it's only connected to Azure Infra and Forest Root. it didn't add the forest root connect, Azure Infra and the Azure AD. It didn't add the forest root object. While the user was migrated, it's not being detected as the same user that was migrated. It's actually not detected at all. If we were to look at user number 8, and then into the connectors.
Have you synced them both?
Yeah, probably need to sync them both. Sorry. Right. No, but the sync should run immediately. Disconnect this for connectors with flow.
Import and sync them both.
Yeah, but I did. Oh, I only did import. That's it. Okay, sorry. Right.
Set a source anchor right away.
Full sync. That's why it's a demo, right? I think I did a sync on it. Didn't I do the import? It's probably AD latency or something. There you go, it's an update. Run, sync, go. Search, user 8. There you go, all 3. Right, so it found that this user has 3 connectors. And that means that the 2 users that I have in my Active Directory domains now are linked to a single user in my Office 365. Which is very handy if you do migrations. And I'll just, for the sake of showing you. So user number 7, still only 2 connectors. Okay.
So Roelf is showing you this with a custom forest anchor. But the default way that Azure AD Connect does this is with the object GUID towards the MSTS consistency GUID. And it only does that on first sync. The problem with that is that in Roelf's scenario, if the user would fall out of scope of Azure AD Connect in the second forest, it would still pick it up when it comes inside of scope.
Let's do that, right? I think we have time, right?
We have time?
We have plenty of time. So
Half an hour. Yep.
let's go into Azure Infra, and I have these 2 users. They've been migrated. I'm done with them, and I'm basically going to decommission the entire Active Directory, or I'm just going to delete these 2 users, right? So they're gonna fall out of scope. That's basically it. So if I do an import on my Azure Infra run, full import or delta import, doesn't really matter. It's going to say that it has 2 deletions because those 2 users are now gone. There you go. In tiny, tiny letters, 2 deletes. So if I then do a run again, do a synchronization, it's basically going to disconnect those 2 connectors from my connector space. There you go. I still have. So user number 7 is gone. Why is user number 7 gone?
Because it wasn't connected from the...
Because it wasn't in the metaverse, right? It didn't have any other connector than the first one. So it didn't show up on the forest root, and therefore if I delete it from the first one, there's no other connector connected to it, we delete the user. User number 8 is still there because it still has a master connector or an on-premises connector, right? So it shows you that this user is now only connected into forest root and not into Azure Infra anymore, right? So what happens if you delete an object? It either gets deleted, or if there's another connector that has the same object, it's going to retain.
So does that work? That was an intra-forest move. Does it also work for inter-forest moves, or is there another scenario? Like, do you have to do extra stuff to make?
No, I didn't test it for an intra, sorry, but it would be exactly the same, because the object GUID is domain specific, not forest specific. So if you were to move it, you still need to do something with your forest anchor.
And you have to have the OU selected.
And you have to have GEO selected, yeah.
So, if you do a move between domains in the same
So the same thing would happen, right? So if you don't use the MSDS consistency GUID, and you're still on the old model, your object GUID itself would change.
No, the object GUID stays the same, because it's within the forest. The SID would change,
Yeah, SID doesn't matter.
but the object GUID stays the same. The problem is that there is a point in time, depending on which domain controllers you're actually hooking up to, there is a point in time when you can either have 0 object GUID show up, or 2 of the same, because the 2 domains are syncing.
So if they show up at the same time, then if you have the forest anchor, then it would link the two. So it's exactly the same as that you have now. It would say domain number 1, domain number 2, pointing to the same user.
I haven't seen this in the ADC stuff, but years ago within just regular Exchange, we had a problem where you moved the user between the domains, and because of the replication cycles, Exchange basically lost them. So they disappear from the Exchange global address list, and we had bounced mail because the users were not, and then they would reappear again. So it took us
Yep.
a long time to track down what was going on.
So I would say the same thing would.
Change the way we did inter-domain moves to actually do it against domain controllers that were close to the global generators, and the 2 domain controllers were actually in the same, were on a very tight replication cycle, so that they disappeared for the shortest amount of time. So I don't know what happens on this, but I can see scenarios where it will disappear and go away again, and if it's the only connector, your Office 365 object could delete, could remove itself, which would cause all sorts of problems to.
Yeah. So if it doesn't find it in forest A, it doesn't find it in forest B, means it's connectorless, and then it gets deleted from the metaverse, and then it gets.
It doesn't just go poof, though.
Yeah.
Microsoft holds it for many, many days, right?
So
30 days, yeah.
30
And then
days.
14 days in purge.
So as long as you're replicating within 30
Yeah.
days.
But you have to be looking for that to know that that happened in the first place.
yeah.
So,
But so it's going to be, it's not going to be then, so it's not going to be deleted, but the Office 365 object is going to be rendered inactive.
Yeah, so people can't get that. So
Yeah.
the thing is.
And and because it's inactive, they would actually be removed from the global address list in Office 365 before they were.
Get bounce mail to outside
Yeah.
world and stuff.
Yeah.
So
Yeah.
there are a number of issues, so that you almost have to make sure you turn off. If you're doing, we actually ended up by doing intra-domain moves at specific times of the day and turn off other replication issues
Yeah.
to avoid that. And it looks to me that the same scenarios occur here. So it's like, if you're going to do an intra-domain move, you turn off the ADC replication, you do the move, you make sure all the objects have gone across before you turn it back on, so that the Office 365 object is never not in the connector scripts.
Correct. So there's a specific PowerShell commandlet that you can run that basically shows you what the last runtime was and what the runtime interval itself is.
Yeah.
And you can change that runtime interval as well if you wanted to. So by default, it's at 30 minutes.
Yeah, but
Yeah.
the easiest way to stop Azure AD Connect from synchronizing is just open the wizard.
Yeah.
First thing it will tell you, I'm stopping synchronization until you're done with this wizard. So that's absolutely the easiest way ever.
You can't open the wizard if it's already running.
Yeah, so you have to wait for the sync
You
dance.
can run the PowerShell command to stop the sync
Yeah, you can.
process because it's scheduled anyway, and then
Yep.
you just run the start AD sync and start it up again.
Yep.
Yep.
So either way, you're messing with the scheduling. Stop the service.
Yeah, but I guess your tip to the people here in this room is to migrate your managers during night times, probably.
Well, on a global company where there is no night.
Yeah.
And it's not a case of when your managers are in, because it's mail coming in from outside, and it's where they're getting mail from. You can't guarantee what times they're getting mail. And the last thing you need is an undeliverable message being sent back to a customer to say we can't do it.
Yep.
The occurrence I'm talking about happened 10 plus years ago when we were doing a big intra-domain move. We had this thing automated to drop something into a group. The group would be monitored. The new object or process would monitor the group and move the objects.
Yep. So what I would do in these,
So actually turn in this case, you have to turn the sync engines off while you were doing it.
yep. So what I would do in this situation was I would actually write a script that as soon as I do a migration, it stops the synchronization engine. You do the migrations, and at the end you do a full import or full cycle, right? Because then at least you know that during the migration nothing happens, and then afterwards you're basically updating everything automatically in the backend. That's how we did it.
And so I did a lot of looking at this. At the point when you're actually doing the migration, it is possible for the object, if you do a search on a specific object that you know is being migrated, you can actually get back two results.
Yes.
And occasionally you can get back 0 because it depends on the way you're looking at it.
Yeah. So 2 results in this case is not bad as long as you have the join anchor, the joining rule in there. The problem is when you don't have to join anchor and it's actually 2 different objects. But we'll take a look at that when we handle conflict resolution. So now that we have multiple Active Directories or actually users automatically being updated or manually being added into the tenant, you can have conflicts. Conflicts can happen in SMTP addresses, in UPN addresses, and display names doesn't really matter, but the most common one is SMTP addresses. Info at blah 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 being set on 2 different users. So how do we deal with that? I have a demo for that as well. Create conflict. So what I do is I basically set conflict at forestroot.net on two different objects, forest user number 3 and forest user number 4. And I'm going to speed up a little bit because I only had 10 minutes left. I'm going to do a full import. So Azure Active Directory Connect doesn't detect duplicate items, right? It's just going to import whatever it's in the Active Directory or in multiple Active Directories. It doesn't care about uniqueness for those specific attributes. So I'm going to run the full or delta sync. So it found 2 updates and it only says the SMTP addresses were updated. But then as soon as I do an export, I'm going to hit an error. And the error is going to actually come into my email. And I made a screenshot of it. This is the error that you're going to get into your email address. The thing is that the latest Azure AD Connect will export. It will continue to export if it's duplicate. And then the filtering is happening on the Azure Active Directory side. If you have an older version of Azure Active Directory Connect, the synchronization will actually stop because the export connector says there's a conflict and I'm not going to export anything. So even if you have one conflict, the other 20,000 updates that you had are not going to go through. So that's why upgrade to the latest connector, you don't have that problem anymore. But you do get this particular email. And the funny part is that while the filtering is happening on Azure AD side, you don't know which one ultimately gets the win. So in this case, apparently, it removed it from forest user number 4, but it could very well be user number 3 the next time that I synchronize. So it's really annoying because then I don't know where the info itself is actually, on which object it actually is. So I could go into Office 365, search for the particular users, search for the particular attributes, see which one has it, and then with the email together, find out what's actually wrong. The other thing that you can do is, since we know in the email it says conflict at, we know what attribute is actually conflicting. If I have multiple forests, it's very hard to identify what's the source object for that conflict, and that's why I usually go to the metaverse itself. So inside the metaverse, I can here say I want to have a search, and in this case I know that it's on proxy addresses. So proxy addresses, and then it should contain, and in this case it's conflict, but otherwise it would be info or whichever you have. You do search, and you immediately get back the two objects that you have. Right? So these two objects are in conflict. If I were to open a specific object, and in this case it's really easy for me because it's just one forest. But if I go to the proxy addresses, you see the contributing management agent. So I have multiple forests. It will say this particular address came from this particular connector. So I know which forest to go to and then remove it. Really easy, right? Conflict resolution.
Any questions on that?
Yeah, what if you get SMTP conflict errors and you don't see it in the metaverse?
So the SMTP conflict errors, you don't see them in the metaverse at all. Because it's not a conflict.
Well, you're looking at the metaverse, I mean, to search for the, you have to hunt through them manually, one by one.
Yes. Based on the email that you get.
Emails are still pretty useless.
No.
Give a guide you where you
Yes.
have scripting or whatever. Have you seen tools that make it easier to resolve some of these conflicts? Microsoft.
Not in the metaverse itself.
Huh?
Not in the metaverse itself.
Yeah.
But I think the ID fix, at least within a forest, or forest, I think will solve it.
Yeah.
Multiple forest, I haven't seen one.
Yeah.
You can still both export both.
Yeah, but then that's like a lot of manual labor. I'd rather have an email saying this is a conflict than.
Yeah.
Yeah, that'd be awesome.
Had a SQL query against Metaverse.
Or a SQL query. Yeah, I'm not a SQL guy, so I have like no idea how that works.
There's an interesting question. Does anybody actually run internal consistency checks within the directory looking for conflicts or inconsistencies within the various directory namespaces, like SAM account name versus UPN name, or email address versus...
So the customer that I was with 2 years ago, they basically had their own MIM or FIM or MIM installation that did the synchronization between the forests before we were to synchronize it into Azure AD Connect. They did some conflict resolution in there, but that was mainly because either the synchronization stopped or something weird happened. It wasn't proactive. It was always reactive. But I don't know if anyone else has scripting or...
I had to do my stuff for mergers and acquisitions 10, 15 years ago for that precise reason.
Yeah.
I just wondered if other people were actually doing similar sort of operations, sort of looking for internal consistency.
I've worked with a lot of different customers, say 10 last year, that were multi-forests, trying to do Office 365, and I can only think of one of them that was doing any kind of proactive, like what you're talking about. And that one was because they actually used the same UPN suffix in all of their forests. And so they had to do magic to make things work.
Yep.
My condolences.
So that's the...
It was ugly.
Yeah, so we didn't mention that yet. But UPN suffixes are like utmost critical important. Not just for the synchronization engine itself, because the synchronization engine can handle it. But it's the authentication that happens next. Right? So if you synchronize all the passwords, you're fine. It's going to work. If you have an ADFS farm that's connected to forest number A, and users come in with like a particular UPN, it's going to try to resolve it, and it's going to try to resolve it locally at that forest. It's not going to jump over to the forest trust to check it on the other side as well. So the customer that I had, the one that I was talking for 2 years ago, they actually had ping. And that would actually search for forest number 1, see if the user was actually there. If it wasn't, it would jump over to forest number 2 and do the authentication over there. Right? So it is possible, but not with ADFS.
Is alternate login ID still supported for ADFS?
Yeah, as far as I know, yeah.
So I've used that as a way to work around a problem similar to that.
Yeah.
It required some fin trickery on the back end.
Yeah. Ultimately, it's going to be custom, right?
Yeah.
So talking about custom, so we did the ground thing, and now we're going into the rules. So you can change the rules within Azure AD Connect. By default, there are like 120 rules or something. If you want to, you can change them. There's actually a link for it. And you can change them via PowerShell or via the GUI. I'm personally a GUI guy, but if you have multiple sync agents and you have the staging ones available as well, I would PowerShell it, or at least export everything to PowerShell from synchronization engine number 1, and then import it into number 2 to make sure that they're equal. But what can you do within a rule? So you can scope an attribute to where the rule applies. So you can say if a user or if a user object has this particular attribute set to this particular value, include it in this rule. If it doesn't, then exclude it from this particular rule, right? And then inside the rule, you have attribute mappings. And attribute mappings can either be direct, display name goes to display name, or you can have an expression which is basically, I don't know if it's a SQL, it's not a SQL expression, but it's a rule that says if this happens, or if this is empty, then do this, or if this is full, then do that. And as you will see in a few minutes, the default rules, expressions, are really, really, really long. So I said there are many, many rules. So even if you have just a user object, it's not a single rule for a user object and a single rule for a group object. In my case, I actually have 4 rules for a single user. So the first rule actually creates the user inside the metaverse and does some standard attributes. And then the other 3, or the second one is account enabled. It will do object sit, UPN, does some connector space specific attributes, such as what's the forest that it's coming from. Then you have the exchange attributes, exchange attribute number 1 till exchange attribute number whatever it is. Phone, emails, account names, etc. And then there's a user common, which is the common attributes that belong to a user, like manager, company, etc. But it also includes phone and mail, which are also included by exchange. And that's where the order of the rules becomes really important. So the lowest number gets executed first, the highest number gets executed last. So if the first rule says the display name equals display name, and the last rule said the display name equals last name, comma, first name, the display name in Office 365 is going to be last name, comma, first name. Right? So let's dive in. So in the same path that you find the MIS client, so C program files, Azure AD Connector, UI shell, you will find the sync rules editor. As said, I'm a GUI guy. I'll zoom in a little bit so you can actually see it. I hope. There we go. So there are 2 types of rules. There's an inbound rule and there's an outbound rule. The inbound or outbound is for both connectors. So I can say inbound from my Active Directory or inbound from Azure Active Directory. I can actually read attributes back from Azure Active Directory and then put them back into the metaverse and then export them if I wanted to the Active Directory or some other system as well. And outbound is obviously the same. So when I started with the migration at my customer 2 years ago, I actually created a rule that said, copy the object GUID from the Active Directory, copy it into the MSDS consistency GUID in the metaverse, and then the second rule, outbound rule, would be if there is an MSDS consistency GUID in the metaverse and it doesn't exist yet on the Active Directory, copy it back and place it into the MSDS consistency GUID on the Active Directory. That's how I would fill the MSDS consistency GUID. As said, luckily they have taken over my my procedure because it's built in by default right now. So let's take a look at rule 102, for example. If you click edit, it's going to ask you to if you want to make a copy of the original rule. If you are going to change anything, my recommendation is yes. So it's going to copy the rule, it's going to disable the original rule, and it's going to create a new rule for you that's based on the old one. In this case, I just want to view, so I'm just going to say no. So what's inside that rule? So as you can see, a rule has a connected system, forced root.local. It has a connected system object type, so there's a different rule for users, there's a different rule for groups, there's a different rule for devices. You're going to link it to a metaverse object type. So in this case, we say the user from Active Directory goes into a person in the metaverse. Right? The link type is join. And that's basically if I want, there's 3 options in there. You can say it's a join. So if there's already an object in there, I'm going to link these objects or these attributes of this object to the existing one. Or you can say provision, and provision actually creates the rule. So the first rule is provision. It actually creates the person object. And then all the other rules are join rules. If you don't know which to choose, join is usually the best one to choose because the create rules are already there by default. And then you have the precedent. So in this case, it's 102. So that's the rule order in which it's going to be executed. The other thing that you might be able to see is that this one actually has the enable password sync. So the password is not an attribute that you say source goes to target. It's actually built into the connector, and it's just a checkbox, and that manages the password synchronization for you, right? And that's basically a security feature built in so that you can't say, I want the password hash from 1 to be copied to an extension attribute in my metaverse and then read everything. So that's not possible. Then you have the scoping filter. So in this case, it says, this rule only applies to accounts where the user account control is not set to 2. So if you want to filter something out, for example, VIPs, and VIPs have in their description VIP, you can say this rule does not apply to if the description field contains VIP. Done. VIPs are outside of the rule. And then you have the transformations. And the transformations are source attribute, target attribute, how are they mapped? Are they directly mapped? So are they one-to-one copied? Or is there an expression in between? So, for example, I'll copy one. I'm just going to show it to you. There we go. So this is one of those expressions that says, if the password last set attribute is present, use that one, and then format it according to a particular format type. So I just want to see year, date, month, hour, seconds. And .0z means it goes into UTF. If it doesn't exist, just type null. Right? Not the value 0, it will be null. It won't be filled.
0 stands for you want to change the password in the next login.
But this is the password last set. This is just the date.
This is the date, yeah.
It can have either null, 0, or the date that you're talking about.
Yeah, set it
So
to
if there's a
0 as
zero-
well. If you set it to 0, you will force the user to change
Okay.
the password in the next login.
Okay, so in this case we set it to null to make sure that that doesn't happen. I didn't know that. So this is the easy one, and if you can take a look at it at home. But this, for example, source anchor binary, which is one of the most important ones because it makes the immutable ID. If you take a look at that one, Control V. As you can see, it's a little bit longer. I don't know what the longest one is, but I think the longest one is like 3 or 4 lines of expressions, right?
And if you want an export of this stuff, there's a Azure AD Connect documenter tool available on GitHub that you can use to dump this kind of stuff before you upgrade, for instance, after you upgrade, and you can actually match them. And the most things that you will see is that precedents get moved around and stuff like that. And sometimes you'll see rules. You can actually predict, if you're basically able to read the rule, what kind of impact an upgrade has.
Yep. So this is, for example, where we make the cloud anchor, right? So it says if exchange recipient details, blah, 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 blah. And here you say, if the consistency good is present, and ultimately at the end of the rule it will say, if consistency good is present, use the MSDS consistency good, else use, and then there's some other anchor types as well.
Those rules are pretty hard to read, but they are, if you break them up, It's a lot easier.
Yeah, you just break them up into different things. So when I did the first change from Object GUID to MSDS Consistency GUID, it was basically going via every rule, replace Object GUID with Consistency GUID, and we were almost there. So, as we enter the last 5 minutes, so changing the rules, you usually use it for filtering out objects from synchronization. As said, if you have a VIP or guest accounts or whatever, and you don't want them to be replicated. But you can also do that with the OU selection, natively from Azure AD Connect, the install wizard, so you don't have to do all of this. You can just go, I just want these particular OUs to be synchronized. Or you do group-based filtering. You add all the users into a group that are synchronized, and then you leave out the group that you don't want synchronized, right?
That's really intended for pilot deployments.
Okay.
And the UI actually specifically says that.
Okay, but the OU selection works anyway. If you want to add additional attributes and synchronize them into Azure Active Directory, or you want to map different attributes, again, that's also possible through the custom installation in Azure AD Connect, because it will ask you what kind of additional attributes do you want to have synchronized, right? If you want to minimize the attribute sync, that's when you need to go into the rule editor.
For the custom attributes, you can't simply take you're extending your schema into the custom attribute. You can't simply move that up to AAD. Right? You have to map it to a different.
No, it will automatically synchronize it for you. If you do Azure AD Connect, it will show you all the attributes that you have in your on-premise AD, including custom ones, and you can say synchronize, and it will synchronize them.
You need to refresh the schema, right?
No.
Connector.
No. So the synchronization
Azure
of
AD Connect does it all for you.
Yep.
Yeah.
And that's because the extended attributes that you have or custom attributes that you synchronize aren't synchronized into the schema of Azure AD. It's actually synchronized into an application in Azure AD that acts as a schema extension for you.
Gotcha. Yeah. They're going to be exposing that a little bit more, I think, in Azure as well. It's kind of something properties or something I read about.
Yeah.
Okay.
So you can do, so for example, on the custom attributes, you can do dynamic groups at the moment, but you can't use them in SharePoint or in Office 365 or anything like that.
Just because I'm feeling that your question is related to the fact that you currently use the Windows Azure AD connector on FIM or MIM, right?
No, we're using the
And we have extensions.
All right.
Yeah.
We've extended our schema with custom extensions, and I just didn't know we could move them up. I think it was something to do with SharePoint one time. They were asking, I was asking Microsoft with SharePoint how to read in a custom extension, and they were like, no, you can't do that.
Yeah. No, so the extension attribute will be uploaded, but it's not known to SharePoint and it's not known to Office 365. Yeah.
And there's a lot of restrictions. So there's only certain types of attributes that you can use that way.
Yeah, but you can use it for your custom application, right? Because you can do SAML or OAuth mapping saying this attribute needs to go into the claim as well. And you need to edit it if you do custom AD migration scenarios, right? So the scenario that I did with the ADMT, that was completely express or custom implementation. I didn't change any rules. But for some cases, you need to change the rules a little bit. If you do change the rules themselves, or even if you do the wizard and you don't use express but custom, make sure that you copy all the changes or note them down to do them in your staging server as well. Because you don't want server A to be completely running, and then as soon as you do a failover, because there's an issue, that you run into more issues because you didn't update the rule set, right? And as the description of this topic said, to keep your Microsoft support, if you do your own rules, make sure that you contact either your Premier or your Microsoft representative to make sure that you're still on a supported model, right? So there some scenarios are unsupported, some scenarios are supported. Many of them are supported, but they just want to know what you actually did. And that concludes it.
Yep. So I guess it's a thank you slide, right?
It doesn't skip.
Yep. Nope. That's the previous one. All right.
That's it.
That's it.
Thank you very much. And of course, I hope to see you all at 4 p.m. at my second talk.
Can I ask one question? Because you said something that I heard.
Let me, so guys, you're invited to stay over. We're gonna answer questions. We're gonna have fun all together. But if you want to leave, if you want to grab lunch, coffee, please feel welcome to do that too. You don't have to stick around when we answer questions. Thank you. But go ahead.
So my